So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So we have already started with this text, and I believe we've had a couple of lectures in this text already. So we'll just dive into the text and just continue from where we left off, because if you remember the final point in which she ended last lecture, we talked about the quality of Marlo's narrative, and was described by the omniscient narrator, the narrator outside the frame, as something which that narrative contains a meaning not in the center but on its periphery, right? So there's a centerless quality about Marlo's narrative which has been emphasized already. And now we'll just move on to this next section, which is important for us for the purpose of this course, and this should be on your screen, where the comparison with the Buddha is very, very directly made. And we saw already at the beginning, at the very introduction of Marlow, the way he's introduced in the text, there was this image of an idol, a god, a tired god, an exhausted god, if you will, with which Marlow was equated and then described. But now the Buddha image comes in quite clearly and quite directly. But of course the entire epiphany, the entire enlightenment that Marlow embodies over here is one of darkness, not of illumination. But the irony is the only knowledge available, the only illumination available, the only epiphany or wisdom available is that of darkness. So the only true knowledge in this particular cultural and political setting is that of darkness. It could be a darkness of horror, of guilt, of exploitation, or the knowledge of exploitation that imperialism represents, etc. So this is what the novel is about. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, it's a bit erroneous to look at Heart of Darkness as a critique of imperialism. It's not really a critique of imperialism. It's not really criticizing. It's not really saying imperialism should be done away with. Because remember, Conrad was a conservative writer, and he was very much in a conservative tradition of writing. But instead of a straight and direct critique of imperialism, what Heart of Darkness represents or offers is an ambivalent attitude about imperialism. This ambivalence about imperialism is what is important for us to understand. And there are politically incorrect qualities about Heart of Darkness. It is, in present-day standards, it is quite racist. In terms of the narrative, there's no non-white voices that we get to hear in Heart of Darkness. But it is precisely because of the politically incorrect quality that is so relevant today. It's not trying to be politically correct at all. It's a novel about confusion, about cognitive confusion, about political confusion, about cultural confusion. So the Buddha image that we're about to see over here is embedded with irony. I mean, it's not an image which is one of straightforward enlightenment or wisdom or clarity of thought or clarity of knowledge, etc. It's rather a knowledge, embodiment of confusion, because the only knowledge available, as I mentioned, is one of darkness and confusion. Okay, so now we see the image quite clearly described to us. Mind, he began again, and this should be on his screen. Mind, he began again, this is Marlow, lifting one arm from the elbow, the palm of the hand outwards, so that with his legs folded before him, he had the pose of the Buddha preaching in European clothes and without a lotus flower. So again, this very curious juxtaposition of Buddha in European clothes and without a lotus flower is part of the entanglement, is part of the confusing and confused entanglement that Marlow embodies. Mind, none of us would feel exactly like this. What saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency. But these chaps were not much account. So these chaps are not much account, really. They're not colonialists. Their administration was merely a squeeze and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want to only brood first, nothing to burst out. When you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. This particular phrase is very, very important, and this is perhaps the most honest description of imperialism offered in this particular novel, as a form of strength which arises just as an accident from the weakness of others. So it's nothing really to boast about. Imperialism is not really a civilizing mission, far from it. It's an exploitative mission, it's a show of force, a show of superiority to brute physical foes, which is actually an accident which emerges from the weakness of other people. Okay, it was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a grand scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. So again, this insight into imperialism is important, and insight is one of cynicism, discomfort, ambivalence, and generally one of guilt. But again, it's not a direct critique of imperialism. That's something I want to emphasize over and over again. So it is a little erroneous, a little problematic to look at Heart of Darkness as a very straightforward deconstruction of imperialism. It's not that at all. It's very much an insider's insight into imperialism and looking at imperialism as what it is, and not really a civilizing mission. And look at the simplicity in Marlow's description over here, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion, so non-white people. So basically, what imperialism is, you just go to a place where you don't live, you take it away, you take away the resources and the the riches and the wealth, and territorialize the place where people with a different complexion live, or slightly flatter noses, right? It's not really the European or Caucasian race we're talking about. So different, the non-Caucasian races, and how do they basically cater to the greed of the Caucasian race, the greed of the white imperialists, is what has been described over here. It's not a pretty thing when I look into it too much. It's not really a pretty thing. It's not a noble narrative. It's not a civilizing mission. It's nothing of that sort. What redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. So, what he's saying over here is interesting, that the only possible redeeming factor of imperialism is the idea of efficiency, the idea of supremacy, an idea which is not sentimental, but something which is an unselfish belief, an unwavering subscription to an idea. And the idea could be one of supremacy, the idea could be one of efficiency, the idea could be one of celebration of supremacy and efficiency put together. But that's the idea which backs imperialism. And that is something you can set up and bow down before and offer sacrifice to. So what is told over here is very important, because what Marlow is saying is, as an individual, you find imperialism as loathsome, as something which is detestable, despicable, because you clearly see it as something of an exploitative machinery. You exploit other people who look different, who have different complexions, who have flatter noses. But what is the only possible redemption about imperialism, according to Marlow in this particular section, is a grand idea of efficiency, a grand idea of efficiency along with supremacy, right? And that grand idea, the grand narrative about efficiency and supremacy, is something that you bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. So you sacrifice your own agency, in the face of that idea, and because you have to bow down and subscribe to the idea. So the idea of supremacy, the idea, the grand narrative about European Caucasian supremacy, is something, according to Marlow over here, that's something which is worthwhile, the only worthwhile justification, the only backbone of imperialism that can possibly redeem it at any level. Okay, so so we can already see the discomfort and the confusion and the very, very ambivalent attitude about imperialism embodied by Marlow, because he's refusing to look at it as a sentimental thing. He's refusing to look at it as a civilizing mission, as something which is noble, as something which is one of redemption for the people who are being exploited. And there's something to be said about the kind of imperialism he's actually representing, because his was, the story over here is sort of Belgian imperialism in Congo, which actually didn't have any pretense of any Christianizing mission or civilizing mission, unlike British imperialism in India, for instance, which had a very lofty narrative about civilizing mission. If we see the writings of Rudyard Kipling, which talks about how imperialism in India was designed to civilize the natives, who presumably, according to Kipling, had no civilization whatsoever. So it was a British civilizing mission that made imperialism a good thing. But Marlow's imperialism, that brand of imperialism over here, although it's European imperialism, but it is Belgian imperialism in Congo, which never had any pretense, any sentimental pretense, as Marlow put it over here, of civilizing or redemptive or whatever in that category. So the very clear-cut idea of imperialism was one of efficiency and supremacy. And Marlow says that the only way it can redeem imperialism was by believing in this narratives of supremacy and efficiency. Okay, so and then of course we have this very panoramic view of London, and it's interesting how the visual narrative in Heart of Darkness is very cinematic in quality, and there have been lots of films loosely based on Heart of Darkness. And the most famous example would be Apocalypse Now by Coppola, which is the setting is different, but if you're interested to watch it, I would do recommend it quite heavily. The setting is in Vietnam, Cambodia, and the setting is an American Vietnam War, and the entire imperialism in that film is one of American imperialism. But apart from that setting, the difference in setting, the rest of the story is very similar. There's a Colonel Kurtz in the film as well, played by Marlon Brando, and the whole story is about recovering and retrieving Colonel Kurtz, and in the process, getting rid of him. So this particular story, How to Darkness, it has historically lent itself to cinematic narratives, to filmic adaptations, and if you see the visual narratives, the way the visual scenes, the visual grammar is depicted, it's quite panoramic in quality. So you have this very close up of Marlo's face, where you can see his wrinkles, his shrunken face, his tired veins on his body, and then you take a long shot of London, which is very panoramic in quality, where it's described as a slowly breathing city, a slowly moving city, something slithery and serpentine about London and Thames, which can only be described using a long shot visual narrative. So this is what is described away. This is how it's described away. Flames glided in the river, small green flames, red flames, white flames, pursuing, overtaking, joining, crossing each other, then separating slowly or hastily. The traffic of the great city went on in the deepening night upon a sleepless river. We looked on, waiting patiently. There was nothing else to do till the end of the flood, but it was only after a long silence when he said in a hesitating voice, "I suppose you fellows remember I did once turn freshwater sailor for a bit, that we knew that we were fated before the ebb began to run to hear about one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences." And look at the way in which the ebb of the river and Marlowe's story as a river, they're sort of conjoined with each other. The fluidity of the river and the fluidity of Marlowe's stories are, they're very dialogue with each other. So in that sense, the setting in River Thames, the fact that the story is told in a floating boat on River Thames, that makes a lot of sense, symbolically speaking, existentially speaking, and also functionally speaking, because we are told the Marlowe stories are one of inconclusive experiences. So there's no conclusion, there's no termination. So the whole inconclusive quality of Marlowe's stories is very much part of the fluidity, the part of the liminality of his experiences. There's no conclusion to be drawn, and that inconclusive quality is part of the cognitive confusion in How to Darkness, right? So the phrases in How to Darkness are very, very important for us to pick and take a good look at. Right, so again, just to reiterate, the ebb beginning to turn, and waiting for the ebb to turn, and listen to Marlowe's inconclusive experience in the form of a very hodgepodge, entangled narrative. They're very dialogue with each other in that category. Okay, so this is a point in the story where the story really starts. So we get to hear Marlowe's story, the real story of How to Darkness. And before that, prior to that, whatever we read so far is part of the unnamed narrator telling us what happens. So we have different frames of narrative in How to Darkness. We have the unnamed narrator who's telling us a story about how he is in a River Thames on a boat along with Marlowe and some of the people. And then inside the narrative, we have Marlowe's story beginning to brew, and now we're about to get Marlowe's story. And then inside Marlowe's stories, there are other stories as well, particularly and most famously, the story of Kurtz, the renegade soldier of imperialism. Okay, so this is what Marlowe begins. Marlowe starts the story with this particular section, and this should be on your screen again. And this is Marlowe telling the rest of the group in that particular boat. "I had then, as you remember, just returned to London after a lot of Indian Ocean, Pacific, China seas, a regular dose of the East, 6 years or so, and I was loafing about, hindering you fellows in your work and invading your homes, just as though I had got a heavenly mission to civilize you." So this whole idea of civilizing the fellow white people is ironical in quality, the heavenly mission to civilize you. It's an ironic, there's an ironic tone in this particular description, because that was a common rhetoric used for imperialism, that the heavenly mission to civilize the non-natives, the non-white natives. That was used rampantly, especially in British imperialism, that the whole idea of imperialism is one of Christianizing, civilizing, etc. So this heavenly mission to civilize you fellow white people is ironic in quality at this point in the story. It was very fun for a time, but after a bit I did get tired of resting. Then I began to look for a ship I should think the hardest work on earth, but the ships would not even look at me, and I got tired of that game too. Now, when I was a little chap, I had a passion for maps, and this particular section is important. So we have how cartography or map making becomes a political process, a political performance, and that is what described over here. When I was a little chap, I had a passion for maps. I would look for ours at South America or Africa or Australia and lose myself in all the glories of exploration. At that time, there were many blank spaces on the earth, and when I saw one that looked particularly inviting on a map, but they all looked that, I'd put my finger on it and say, when I grow up, I will go there. So, you know, this little section was is actually very, very loaded in quality. So map making, as you all know, was very much a cartographic construction, was very much part of the imperial mission. Because map making, in order to make a map, you need to classify territories, and classification can only happen from a particular point of view, a particular political point of view. So, you know, the whole idea of territorializing unfamiliar places, militarily territorializing, politically territorializing, economically territorializing, is accompanied by classifying those places, giving names to those places. So map making has always been a very political activity. And Marlow talks about a time where there were blank spaces on the earth. The map of the earth had blank spaces, which meant that there were still not invaded territories or not territorialized spaces. So those are places which were still open for imperialism, still open for exploration, open for territorialization. So in a map making was very much a territorializing activity, as you all know. It was a very political territorializing activity, and Marlow's allusion to blank spaces on the earth, so spaces which have not been visited yet, is important over here, because what that means is he has this fantasy of territorializing. He has this fantasy, this very European white fantasy of territorializing and controlling those spaces, right? So, you know, that is very, very you know, clearly evident even in Marlow's imagination from his early years. So when he talks about his fantasy for map making, his fantasy for looking at maps, and his entire projected fantasy to go to the places which are blank on earth, that is very much part of the white masculinist supremacist narrative of white imperialism. Right, so I'd put my finger on it and say, when I grow up, I will go there. The North Pole was one of those places I remember. Well, I haven't been there yet and shall not try now. That glamour is off, because it's not really a place for imperialism. The North Pole, there's no resources, there's no oil mine, there's no diamond mine, there's no wealth to be heard from the North Pole. So it's not really. So one thing is very, very clear, that when Marlow says the glamour is off, the whole fantasy, the whole fascination to travel to unnamed places, unclassified places, uncharted places, is not really one of geographical travel. It's not really one of that of the pure traveler. It's very much part of the political fantasy to territorialize. It's very much part of the political fantasy to control, to classify that particular space. And so it's very much part of the imperial grid, where you can go to a place, territorialize it, and take away the wealth, because the North Pole would not serve the purpose. There are no places, there are no natives over there, there's no wealth over there, there's no resources over there, unlike you know, South America, Australia, or Asia, where there are land mines, there are gold mines, sorry, there are gold mines, there are diamond mines, there are oil fields, and there are other kinds of resources to be you know, looted or controlled. So the glamour of the North Pole never really had a glamour in imperial fantasy, is because it is. It's not really an imperialist kind of space. Other places were scattered about the hemispheres. I have been in some of them, and well, you won't talk about that. But there was one yet, the biggest, the most blank, so to speak, that I had a hankering after, and that, of course, is Africa. So Africa over here becomes the fantasy space for the white imperial imagination. The biggest blank space, the most blank, so to say, the place which hadn't been traveled to, the place which hadn't been trodden or territorialized yet. And that territorialization is still awaiting, still pending. So Africa becomes very much that kind of space. So he had a hankering for that kind of space, fascination and fantasy to control that space. True, by this time, it was not a blank space anymore. It had got filled since my boyhood with rivers and lakes and names. Again, you know, the whole idea of filling up the blank space with rivers and lakes and names means that, you know, the white imperialist travelers are going there and territorializing and taking over, because you can only give names to places from a particular perspective. Obviously, those places had names. Obviously, those places had cultures and names and designations and everything else, but it's just that it was all African local names, which are unknown to the white imperial European imagination. So map making was very much a Eurocentric imperial process. It was a process of classification, a process of containment, a process of territorialization. So when you give names to places, basically you authorize, you legitimize territorialization, you consolidate and confirm territorialization. And I'm reminded at this point of Robinson Crusoe, the novel by Daniel Defoe, which is quite possibly one of the first, definitely one of the first novels about white territorialization in a non-white space. Now, those of you who read the novel, and I suspect most of you have, you would know that when Crusoe rescues a native from that place, from cannibals, he names him Friday, or Man Friday, which is to say that he gives him a name, he gives him a Christian name, makes him a Christian, and in the process he brands him as his property. He sort of territorializes him. So by naming him Friday, he's doing two things. First of all, he's erasing away his pre-imperial identity, because of course the man had a name. We never got to hear the name. And secondly, he's giving him a classified category, he's giving him a classified construct. Friday, the name given to him, it was a white man's name, it was a white name. So in the process, he is claiming and consolidating him as a property. So likewise, when Marlo says over here that Africa is getting filled in, the big blank space of Africa is getting filled in with names and rivers and different kinds of lakes, which is to say that more and more African, more and more European travelers are going there, imperial travelers are going there and giving names to those places, taking over those places, territorializing those places. So that ceased to be a blank space for delightful mystery, a white patch for a boy to dream gloriously over. So again, look at the very masculinist fantasy over here, a boy dreaming gloriously over, a white patch for a boy, a white patch for a white boy actually, to dream gloriously over. So that is a mystery space, an exotic space without a name. So that exoticism, that exotic quality is very quickly going away, very quickly disappearing, because more and more white imperial narratives are happening in Africa, and with those imperial narratives we have classifications coming in. It had become a place of darkness, but there was in it one river especially, a mighty big river that you could see on the map, resembling an immense snake uncoiled with its head in the sea, its body at rest, curving afar over a vast country, and its tail lost in the depths of the land. So again, this fascination with Congo, which is hardly named in Heart of Darkness, the river, but the way it's described, an immense snake uncoiled. So it's very serpentine in quality, it's very exotic in quality, and it's described in very exotic markers, reified, commodified exotic markers, and definitely it's feminized as well. So the entire space of Africa, the entire people of Africa, they are feminized by this white masculinist imagination as exotic signifiers, as exotic locales, so to say. So the whole idea of the immense snake uncoiled becomes, first of all, it's dehumanized. Secondly, it is reified into something of an exotic quality, an exotic entity, so to say. So the river Congo is not named, but described as a mighty big river, as an immense snake uncoiled with its head in the sea, its body at rest, curving afar over a vast country, and its tail lost in the depths of the land. So it's like a tail-biting snake, so there's no tail left at all. So again, this inconclusive quality of Marlowe's storytelling is evident in the very beginning when it's describing certain things. And as I looked at the map of it in a shop window, it fascinated me as a snake with a bird, a silly little bird. So again, look at the way in which this gaze is happening. I looked at the map of it in a shop window. So it's very much a consumer's kind of a thing. So Marlow goes to a shop window and he sees the map of Africa over there. So it's very much something to be consumed by the white male imagination, adventure-loving imagination. And it fascinates him as a snake would a bird, a silly little bird. So interestingly, the entire hunting narrative is reversed over here, which is very ironical in quality. So the River Congo, or the white space of Africa, that little patch, the white little patch which is still unnamed, it appears to Marlow as a snake, and he thinks of himself as a bird about to be gobbled or devoured by the snake, where historically and politically it was the other way around. As we know, it was the white travelers, the white imperialists would go to Africa and take control, take it over, territorialize it completely. So the bird snake imagery way is interesting. It's a very interesting and ironic reversal of the historic phenomenon of imperialism, where it was a white imperialist going over and hunting down the non-white spaces, the non-white people, the non-white locales. But over here, the hunting narrative is reversed in terms of its markers. So the white man compares himself as a bird, and he looks at himself, looks at the mighty black river, quote unquote black river, non-white river, in a shop window, which is completely consumerist in quality, as a snake. Then I remember there was a big concern, a company for trade on that river. Dash it all, I thought to myself, they can't trade without using some kind of craft on that lot of freshwater steamboats. Why shouldn't I try to get charge of one? I went along Fleet Street but could not shake off the idea. The snake had charmed me. So again, he thinks that there's a company which is trading on the river, and they obviously need steamboats, so he thinks he can advertise for a position, he can apply for a position, as a captain of a steamboat, presumably. And then he goes on Fleet Street in London, but could not shake off the idea the snake had charmed me. So it's almost biblical in quality, how he has been sort of bitten by the snake, and now is tempted to buy the forbidden fruit of imperialism. So now he's about to take or taste the forbidden fruit of imperialism in Africa, because the snake has charmed him. It's just like a snake in the Garden of Eden, who is about to destroy Marlo's innocence, so to say. So again, this kind of metaphors are very ironic in quality, because we are given an image that is the naive white man is charmed or intoxicated by the non-naive, surreptitious and potentially problematic and pernicious African marker, which is the river Congo here. And as a result of which, the naive white man is becoming a victim to that kind of an imagination, becoming a victim to that kind of an idea of imperialism. And that whole reversal, as I mentioned, of the hunter-hunted narrative is important for us to understand the way, right? Because historically, we all know it was the other way around all the time, consistently. It was the white man who was a hunter, who hunted and totalized non-white spaces. But in this particular session, it's reversed in a very ironic way. You understand, it was a continental concern, that trading society, but I have a lot of relations living on the continent, because it's cheap and not so nasty as it looks, they say. So continent, of course, here is Europe, so it's a European company. So now Europe means Brussels. Interestingly, even then Europe meant Brussels to Joseph Conrad, and it's very, very dialogue-y with the way Europe is perceived by English people today. EU is always Brussels today. So I'm sorry to own that I began to worry them. This was already a fresh departure for me. I was not used to get things that way, I always went on my own road and on my own legs where I had a mind to go. I want to believe it of myself, but then you see, I felt somehow I must get there by hook or by crook. So again, this whole compulsion to be there, somehow get a job in that particular company, just so he can be in Brussels and in Congo, just so he can be in this projected fantasy space, is something which pushes Marlo to really go after people, nag them for the job, etc. Use all his contacts, use all his relatives' contacts in order to get the job. Okay. My dear fellow, the man said, my dear fellow, and did nothing. Then, would you believe it, I tried the woman. I, Charlie Marlow, set a woman to work to get a job. Heavens, well, you see, the notion drove me. And this is the point that I want to spend some time on and end the lecture here today. The presence of woman figures in How to Darkness, of female figures in How to Darkness. So look at the condescending way, the patronizing way Marlow talks about the woman, that I went to the extent of using women to get a job. So the presumption is women can't get you anything, so women are powerless, but I use them as well in order to get a job. So again, the location of the woman, the location of the female figure, apropos of white male imperialism, is very problematic in How to Darkness. And I think I did touch upon a little bit of that issue at the beginning of the introductory lecture. But what Marlow says over here and what he continues to say about the woman is interesting and problematic at the same time. I mean, it's interesting because it's problematic. So he says, I even tried the woman, and then he mentions one of his aunts. I had an aunt, a dear enthusiastic soul. She wrote, it will be delightful. I'm ready to do anything for you. It's a glorious idea. I know the wife of a very high personage in the administration, and also a man who has lots of influence with, etc. She was determined to make no end of fuss to get me appointed skipper of a river steamboat, if such was my fancy. So this aunt very conveniently comes and gives Marlow the right contacts to apply for the job, and she happens to know people. She happens to know the wife of someone who is very highly placed in that company and administration, and then someone with a lot of influence as well. So she puts them in touch with the right people, and that gets his job done. So again, I'm going back to Robinson Crusoe. If you look at that Daniel Defoe narrative, I'm sure most of you read it, you find that there are hardly any woman figures in the narrative at all. I mean, Crusoe marries in the end of the novel, and his wife just inhabits one sentence in the entire novel, while we're told that Crusoe marries her, and then she produces male children, and then she dies, very conveniently, all within one sentence. So the entire presence of woman in Robinson Crusoe, which is essentially and symbolically one of the first European imperial narratives in fiction, led to the presence of woman. The function of woman is strictly, as that of a breeder, is that of someone who's backing the men, someone who's extremely subservient and secondary to the entire male fantasy of totalization and imperialism. And we have this aunt over here who's not even named. We never know the name of the aunt, but she gets the job done for Marlo. She just occupies a little section of the novel where we're told that she puts them in touch with the right people. She knows another woman who's the wife of someone high in the administration, and then a man who has some influence in the company, and that's how he gets his appointment. So I got my appointment, of course, and I got it very quick. It appears the company had received news that one of their captains had been killed in a scuffle with the natives. This was my chance, and it made me the more anxious to go. It was only months and months afterwards, when I made the attempt to recover what was left of the body, that I heard the original quarrel arose from a misunderstanding about some hens. Yes, 2 black hens. Fresleven, that was the fellow's name, a Danish person who was an earlier captain, in whose place Marlo would be going as the captain of a particular steamboat, thought himself wrong somehow in the bargain, so he went ashore and started to hammer the chief of the village with a stick. So, this is the imperial narrative began to make its presence felt. The Danish guy called Fresleven, who was in charge of the steamboat, he thought that he had been conned, he had been robbed of some bargain over 2 black hens. So he went all the way ashore and started to hammer and whip the chief of the village with a stick. It didn't surprise me in the least to hear it, and at the same time to be told that Fresleven was the gentlest, quietest creature that ever walked on 2 legs. So this is a very important point, because we are told that Fresleven is a very European, a gentle European. But look at what happens to gentle European in Africa, in the Congo. So this atavistic avatar is unleashed, and he becomes a cruel sadist in that colonial setting. And this is what Marlo tells immediately after. No doubt he was, but he had been a couple of years already out there engaged in the noble cause. The noble cause of imperialism is very ironic over here, and he probably felt the need, that at last, of asserting his self-respect in some way. So the whole white supremacist idea of asserting supremacy, asserting self-respect, asserting in superiority compared to the natives, was what drove Fresleven to whip the chief of the particular village. Therefore, he whacked the old nigger. Again, the word nigger appears in Heart of Darkness as a banned word now, but then again, this is exactly why the novel is important for us today, because of its political incorrectness. He whacked the white nigger mercilessly, where the big crowd of people watched him thunderstruck, till some man, I was told the chief's son, in desperation at hearing the old chap yell, made a tentative jab with a spear at the white man, and of course it went quite easy between the shoulder blades. Then the whole population cleared into the forest, expecting all kinds of calamities to happen, while on the other hand, the steamer Fresleven commanded left also in a bad panic, in charge of the engineer, I believe. So, it was just the white man's, the chief of the village, his son could not bear it anymore, could not bear his father being beaten so mercilessly anymore, so he drove an arrow in Fresleven's shoulders, and that killed him instantly. And what is interesting to see how the entire village disappeared immediately after, because they thought, because the white man has been killed, some natural calamity will happen to them. And again, look at the way in which the idea of supremacy is ingrained in imperialism. You have to convince the non-white people that the white man is superior, that the white man is God. So killing the white man is almost a sin, not a crime. So there'll be a divine retribution, there'll be a divine calamity. So the whole entire village just disappeared, fearing the calamity to happen. And the steamer in which Fresleven commanded, that ran away as well, that escaped as well in bad panic, because this was an accident, it was an interruption of what normally happens, the normative, normal narrative imperialism, where the white man beats the non-white man. So that narrative has been interrupted with the white man being killed over here. So that steamer had left in charge of the engineer. Afterwards, nobody seemed to trouble much about Fresleven's remains till I got out and stepped into his shoes. I couldn't let it rest though, but what an opportunity offered at last to meet my predecessor. The grass growing through his ribs was tall enough to hide his bones. So when Marlo finally meets the corpse of Friesleven, he finds the grass had grown long enough through his ribs to hide the bones. So it's a very symbolic image of the white man going and meeting his predecessor, the earlier imperialists who had been killed and whose skeleton remains are present now. Okay, so and then this whole idea of calamity, the whole idea of fear of having killed a white man, and that is described in some details. And then we are told the mad terror had scattered them. The village was a mad terror because they were convinced that some calamity would befall them. Men, women and children through the bush, and they had never returned. What became of the hens, I don't know either. So again, look at there's almost a dark comic quality in Heart of Darkness as well, which keeps making its presence felt. Because the entire quaddle away, the entire tiff away is about some hens. So Marlo says, I don't know what happened to the hens, because the entire beating was because of the hens, the entire murder happened because of the hens. So I should think the cause of progress got them anyhow. However, through this glorious affair, I got my appointment. Therefore, I fairly began to hope for it. So it's because Friesleven, the Danish captain of the particular steamboat, got killed because of two hens. Bargain about two hens is because of why Marlo gets this job. So look at the way. I mean, the reason why the entire thing is trivialized, and that tells us something as readers. When you actually come to the bottom of it, how imperialism is actually about a bargain. It's actually about bargains gone bad. It's about one-sided bargains. It's about the terror that comes out of bargains. But essentially, it is about bargains. It's about a mercantile activity, a merciless mercantile activity. It's a mercenary mercantile activity, which is what it's all about. So everything around imperialism, the noble narrative about civilizing, superiority, supremacy, etc., if you take all that away, it all comes down to a bargain. So the two hens over here are important. They're quite symbolic presences in this point in the story, because what we're told is, the entire quarrel, the entire tussle, the tiff that happened was because of the two hens. And the Friesleven, the Danish person, was very gentle otherwise, he somehow thought because he got a bad bargain, he had to make his superiority felt, he had to assert his superiority. So he got ashore, started whipping the black man, the chieftain of the village, and at some point when the son of the chieftain could not take it anymore, he drove an arrow through Friesleven's ribs, and that killed him immediately. And that was the reason why Marlo got the job in the first place. So he had to fill in a vacancy which had emerged, which had happened because of an accident, which had happened because of a bargain. So it all came down to a bargain about two hens, and the two hens over here become a symbolic presence over here, because that tells us that imperialism at the end of it all, at the bottom of it all, is about bargains. So I'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue with the story as we move on to the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.